Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to London today is not just another photo opportunity on the Downing Street doorstep. It's a crisis tutorial in the difference between peace on the one hand and what you might call solution and closure on the other. Priti Patel is right about one central point. I don't normally say this. Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. But Donald Trump and Putin both want a kind of closure. A deal they can live with, a solution, a line they can draw under this war. That is precisely why Zelensky is in London and why Europe is so nervous. To start with the visit itself, Zelensky has come to Downing Street to meet Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz at what Starmer has described as a critical stage in the push for peace. The talks centre on the revised US peace plan and in particular the future of Donbass, and the Americans have been floating versions of a proposal that would see Ukraine give up the entire Donbass region and accept long-term limits on NATO membership or forced posture. Zelensky confirmed before flying to London that there's no agreement on territorial swaps and that Donbass remains the most contentious unresolved issue. At the same time, Trump has publicly complained that Zelensky has not even read the latest proposal, while insisting that Russia is, I believe, fine with it, and suggesting that it's Kyiv holding things up, while insisting that Russia is fine. The choreography here matters. In Washington, Trump presents himself as the deal maker knocking heads together. In Moscow, Putin has just spent more than 5 hours with Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff discussing the US plan and then immediately following those talks with massive missile and drone strikes across Ukraine. That sequence is exactly what Priti Patel is pointing to. In her interview, Patel is blunt. Trump is wrong about Putin's desire for peace. There's no evidence that Putin wants to end the war. On the contrary, he's using the talks to buy time while his forces continue their slow, grinding advance. Even as US and Ukrainian negotiators meet in Florida and Witkoff and Kushner shuttle off to Moscow, Russia was launching one of its largest recent barrages, more than 600 drones and 50 missiles in a single night, and pushing forward in eastern Ukraine. That is not the behaviour of a leader looking for a compromise. It's the behaviour of a man who thinks violence is improving his leverage. Now, set that alongside the new US national security strategy. The Trump administration's document talks about the need for an expeditious end to the war and to re-establish strategic stability with Russia, while describing Europe as facing civilizational erasure from migration. It promises to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations by working with patriotic European parties. The Kremlin was quick to praise this text, noting with satisfaction that the US has stopped treating Russia as a direct threat and is instead recasting Europe as the main problem. So, what does Putin want? 3 things broadly. First, he wants conquest dressed up as compromise. Russian officials keep insisting that Ukraine must hand over the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk as part of a deal, even though Russia currently occupies only part of those regions. A peace built on those terms would reward aggression and amputate some of Ukraine's most important defensive cities. Second, he wants impunity. There's no sign of any willingness to accept responsibility, to submit to war crimes tribunals, or even to acknowledge wrongdoing. On the contrary, the Russian state continues to justify the invasion in grand civilizational language and to celebrate advances on the ground. Third, he wants time. Time to digest what he's taken, integrate occupied territories, rebuild his forces under a partial truce and prepare the ground for the next round. That's why Russian troops continue to push forward in the east and why Ukraine is forced to retool its mobilization and training for a long war. That is the background against which Patel says quite reasonably there is no cessation, there is no indication of peace whatsoever, and that Putin's conduct gives no grounds for trusting his intentions. On that central assessment, she is right. But it is equally important to be precise about Trump. He doesn't want peace in the sense that Zelensky uses the word. A just and durable settlement that leaves Ukraine secure and Russia deterred. What he wants is closure. He wants to be able to say to Americans facing a cost of living crisis that he has stopped the war and stopped the spending. He wants a signing ceremony, a headline, perhaps even a Nobel Prize nomination. Above all, he wants to move on to other fights. Venezuela, migration, conflict with Brussels over tech and trade. So yes, Trump and Putin want a solution and closure, But they want it for themselves, and they want it on terms that suit their domestic narratives. For Putin, closure is locking in the land he has taken, resetting his economy under a new frozen conflict. For Trump, closure is cutting a deal that ends the war cheaply for the US, even if the bill is paid in Ukrainian territory. Neither conception of closure matches what Zelenskyy is arguing for. That is why today's London meeting matters. Starmer, Macron and Merz are trying to build a common position in which Ukraine and Europe define the minimum conditions for a settlement and then present them as a united front to Washington. Macron spoke openly about the need for convergence between European, Ukrainian and US positions, insisting that Europe and Kyiv still have a lot of cards in our hands. Not least their ongoing financial and military support for Ukraine and the pressure their sanctions place on Russia's fragile economy. Merz signalled German scepticism about some of the US text, and Starmer stressed that any ceasefire must be just and lasting and that matters about Ukraine are for Ukraine. At the same time, Europe is arguing over how to use frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's defence and reconstruction, with Belgium and France dragging their feet on a proposed €140 billion loan backed by those assets. Zelensky's trip to Brussels straight after London is part of the same effort to lock in long-term European funding and security guarantees so that Ukraine is less exposed to swings in US politics. All of this plays out against Antonio Costa's warning shot in Paris. In response to the US strategy's talk of civilizational erasure, and its plan to cultivate resistance inside Europe by boosting parties like AfD, National Rally, Vox and Reform UK, Costa said simply, the United States cannot replace European citizens in choosing which parties are good and which parties are bad. Europe, he argued, must remain sovereign, free to regulate tech firms such as Twitter, to define its own rules on migration, to set its own terms for support to Ukraine, without Washington being using populist allies as leverage. So we have a triangle. Putin wants land impunity and time. Trump wants a headline, a saving and a scapegoat if things go wrong. Ukraine and Europe want survival, justice and deterrence. The danger is that solution and closure on Trump and Putin's terms means a ceasefire that freezes the front roughly where it is, amputates more of Ukraine, caps its armed forces, and leaves its NATO prospects permanently ambiguous, all without strong enforcement guarantees. That would not settle the conflict, it would postpone it. We've already seen what happens when aggression is rewarded and limited territorial concessions under weak agreements are imposed. The Minsk deals in 2014 to 15 bought quiet for a while, and then the full invasion came. Patel is therefore right about the illusion at the heart of Trump's rhetoric on Putin. There is no evidence that Putin is secretly yearning for peace and being thwarted by hawks in Kyiv or Brussels. The evidence shows the opposite. Russia applauds a US strategy that stops treating it as a threat, continues drone strikes on civilians, and demands more land in return for a pause. Where the real work lies now is not in flattering Trump's instincts, but in harnessing his desire for closure to a settlement that doesn't betray Ukraine or Europe's own security. That means 3 tests for any eventual deal. It must restore as much of Ukraine's territorial integrity as possible. It must contain credible guarantees and resources to deter renewed Russian aggression, and it must avoid turning Europe into a protectorate of either Washington or Moscow. Zelensky's visit today is about trying to write those tests into a script before Trump and Putin try to write the ending themselves.